Let the candle's weary flame whisper to you now, brethren, of sins buried deep in the loam, where the cypress roots clutch at forgotten bones. Ah, yes. Even then, in the shadowed heart of the Deep South, the transaction happened in broad daylight. September 14th, 1858, outside the Blackthorn County Courthouse in Sorrowfen, Mississippi, Elijah Thorne Hawthorne, a respected cotton planter, handed over the custody of his wife, a woman whose weight had reached 347 pounds, to a horse trader named Reuben Silas Crow. In exchange, Hawthorne received one purebred Morgan Stallion valued at $600. Witnesses watched in stunned silence as both men signed documents making the exchange official, while Magnolia Belle Hawthorne stood beside them, her face unreadable, the river fog drifting like a burial shroud across the square, Versi, and the scent of damp earth rising as if the ground itself mourned. The crowd expected scandal. What they got instead was far worse, because Reuben Silas Crow hadn't made this trade out of kindness or opportunity. He'd orchestrated the entire situation as calculated revenge against the man who'd insulted him. And what Crow did next over the following months would destroy everything Elijah Hawthorne valued more than the wife he'd traded away. This is the story of the most shocking transaction in Mississippi history and the revenge that followed it. Before we continue with the story of how a horse trader turned one man's cruelty into the perfect vengeance, hit that subscribe button on Forgotten Liturgy and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Stories like this one deserve to be remembered, and your engagement helps us uncover more forgotten chapters of American history.
Sorrowfen, Mississippi in 1858 stood as one of Blackthorn County's most prosperous towns, situated along the crucial trade route between New Orleans and the Mississippi River's settlements. With a population nearing 2,000 souls, the town boasted 3 cotton gins, 2 banks, a courthouse built from imported limestone, and enough brick buildings along Main Street to rival cities twice its size. Candlelight flickering on cracked cypress walls in the evening hush, wealth from cotton and timber had transformed Sorrowfen from frontier outpost to genteel southern town in less than 2 decades, complete with a literary society, a Masonic lodge, and families whose names appeared on deeds stretching back to the Mississippi Territory. The Hawthorne family occupied a notable position in this hierarchy. Elijah Thorne Hawthorne had inherited 400 acres of prime bottomland from his father, along with 12 enslaved workers and a modest but respectable 2-story house built in the Greek Revival style that signaled ambition toward true planter status. Ah, brethren, the weight of those haunted plantations pressing down. At 34, Elijah had expanded his holdings to 600 acres and increased his workforce to 18, positioning himself for entry into the county's upper echelon. He dressed well, attended the Methodist Church faithfully, and served as treasurer for the local agricultural association. His wife, Magnolia Belle, had been born Magnolia Rose Thibodeau, daughter of a merchant family in nearby Willow Bend. Their marriage 7 years earlier had been considered advantageous for both families. The Thibodeaus gained connection to land wealth, while Elijah acquired a substantial dowry and the social standing that came with an educated wife who could read French and play piano. Wedding guests at the Thibodeau home in June 1851 had remarked on what a handsome couple they made, though even then Magnolia Belle carried more weight than fashion deemed appropriate for a woman of 22. Over the following years, Magnolia Belle's size had increased dramatically. Some attributed it to the stillborn twins she delivered in their second year of marriage, a loss that sent her into to prolonged melancholy and sedentary habits. Others whispered about the cook who prepared elaborate meals that Magnolia Belle consumed alone in the afternoon after Elijah had returned to the fields. By 1858, Magnolia Belle rarely left the Hawthorne house, spending her days in the parlor with her needlework or upstairs in her bedroom where servants brought meals on trays. Her size had become a source of gossip throughout Sorrowthan, not just for its physical manifestation, but for what it represented about Elijah Hawthorne's household management and, by extension, his fitness for the higher social circles he sought to enter. Elijah's frustration with his domestic situation had become increasingly apparent to those who knew him. At agricultural association meetings, after several glasses of bourbon, he would complain about the burden of maintaining a household that offered him no sons, no social advantage, and increasingly no escape from humiliation. The Thibodeau dowry had long since been absorbed into plantation operations. Magnolia Belle's social connections had atrophied, along with her ability to participate in county society. What remained was a woman who, in Elijah's calculation, cost more in food and embarrassment than she contributed to his aspirations. "I tell you true, the cursed souls of the deep south whispered in the wind." Reuben Silas Crow presented an entirely different figure in Blackthorn County society, a horse trader who operated from a sprawling property 5 miles west of Sorrowthan. Crow had arrived in Mississippi from Kentucky in 1852 with a reputation for identifying quality bloodlines and an uncanny ability to train difficult animals. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with a lean, weathered build of a man who spent his days in saddles and corrals rather than parlors. His voice carried a Kentucky drawl that became more pronounced when discussing horses, which is to say, most of the time. The dust of forgotten trails clinging to his boots like spectral chains. Unlike the settled planters who formed Sorrowthan's elite, Crow lived in a state of perpetual motion, traveling throughout East Mississippi and into Louisiana, Alabama, and the Indian Territory, buying and selling horses, sometimes gone for weeks at a time. His property reflected this itinerant lifestyle: a large barn maintained with meticulous care, several well-built corrals, and a modest house that clearly served as way station rather than home. Crow employed 3 men to maintain his operation during his absences: 2 handlers for the horses and 1 older black man named Josiah, who cooked and kept the house. Crow's business brought him into contact with every level of Blackthorn County society. Planters needed quality stock for fieldwork and transportation. Common farmers required sturdy draft animals. Even the town's Presbyterian minister had purchased a gentle mare from Crow. This democratic approach to commerce gave Crow unusual social latitude. He was invited to dine at planter tables when he had horses to show, but he also drank whiskey in establishments where gentlemen feared to be seen. He attended horse races, cockfights, and the informal gatherings where business was conducted through handshakes rather than contracts. In June 1858, 3 months before the courthouse transaction, Crow had sold Elijah Hawthorne a young gelding that proved to have a split hoof hidden beneath expert grooming. When Elijah discovered the defect and demanded his money back, Crow had been in Alabama. By the time he returned in mid-July, Elijah had already spread word throughout the county about the horse trader's dishonesty, damaging Crow's reputation among the planters who formed his most profitable customer base. The incident rankled Crow not just for the lost business, but for what he perceived as Elijah's misrepresentation of a transaction that Crow considered fair. The horse had been sold as is, and any experienced horseman should have examined the animal more carefully. Their confrontation at the Agricultural Association's summer meeting had been brief but memorable. Elijah, surrounded by fellow planters, had loudly demanded recompense. Crow, standing alone, had replied that any man who couldn't properly examine a horse before purchase had no business questioning the seller's integrity. The exchange had ended with Elijah ordering Crow off the property, and Crow responding with a smile that those present would later describe as distinctly unsettling. "I'll have satisfaction for this insult," Elijah had declared. "Name your terms." "I'll consider the matter," Crow had replied, still wearing that peculiar smile, "and let you know when I've determined what constitutes fair compensation." Mercy, the shadows lengthened like fingers of historical horror.
The response had seemed odd at the time, Crow's Kentucky drawl making it sound almost courteous, though several men present noted the cold calculation in his eyes. In the culture of Southern honor that governed such disputes, Elijah had essentially challenged Crow to name the terms of their settlement. What none of them anticipated was how literally Crow would interpret that invitation. Throughout August, Crow made inquiries around Sorrowfen. He spoke with the Hawthorne family's house servants at the market, asking casual questions about the household's functioning. He visited the Thibodeau family in Willowbend on the pretext of looking at a mare they had for sale, engaging Magnolia Belle's father in conversation about his daughter's welfare. He attended church services at the Methodist congregation where the Hawthornes worship, observing from the back row. To those who noticed, Crow appeared to be conducting research, though for what purpose remained unclear. Sorrowfen in that summer of 1858 existed in a state of prosperous tension. Cotton prices remained high, encouraging expansion and speculation. Political debates about Kansas and the territories consumed attention in the town's 3 newspapers. Young men formed militia companies with elaborate uniforms, drilling on Saturday afternoons in anticipation of conflicts that still seemed distant and abstract. Beneath this surface animation, the rigid hierarchies of Southern society governed every interaction, and any disruption to established order attracted intense scrutiny. Into this environment, Reuben Silas Crow brought a proposal that would violate every assumption about how such societies functioned. The bayou mist, curling like cursed smoke from the earth. The first indication that something unusual was developing came on September 10th, when Crow appeared at the Hawthorne Plantation House in mid-morning, riding a magnificent Morgan Stallion that drew immediate attention from everyone who saw it. The horse stood just over 15 hands high, with a deep chest, powerful hindquarters, and a coat so dark it appeared almost black except where sunlight revealed hints of deep mahogany. Its bloodlines were evident in every proportion. This was breeding stock worth substantial money, the kind of animal that could establish a planter's reputation for quality. Elijah Hawthorne came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth, having been working in his study on plantation accounts. His expression shifted from surprise at the visitor to undisguised interest in the stallion. Crow sat easily in the saddle, making no move to dismount. "That's a remarkable animal," Elijah said, descending the porch steps for a closer look. "Morgan stock, sired by Woodbury," Crow replied, naming one of the most celebrated Morgan lines. "Dam was pure Justin Morgan descent, through Sherman. He's 4 years old, fully trained to saddle and harness both. Temperament like silk. And he's already proven himself with 3 mares back in Kentucky. Could sell for top dollar." Elijah circled the horse slowly, running his hands over the stallion's legs, examining teeth, checking confirmation with the eye of someone who understood quality. The horse stood perfectly still, displaying the calm disposition that made Morgan's valuable for more than just appearance. "What's his price?" Elijah asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the figure would exceed his current means. "I'm not here to sell him to you," Crow said flatly. "I'm here to offer a trade." Elijah stepped back, confusion crossing his features. "I have nothing that would equal this animal's value." "That's a matter of perspective," Crow replied. "I've given considerable thought to our dispute from July, and to your challenge that I name terms for satisfaction. I've determined what would constitute fair compensation for the damage you did to my reputation." "Name it then," Elijah said, irritation creeping into his voice. "I won't stand here playing guessing games." Crow looked toward the house,
where a curtain moved in an upstairs window. Magnolia Belle watching from her usual position. "I'll trade you this stallion, clear title, in exchange for your wife." The words hung in the morning air like something physical. Elijah's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, then something more calculating. "That's absurd! You can't trade a horse for a person, for a wife, can't I?" Crow's tone remained conversational. "You and I both know that property transfers happen every day in Blackthorn County. Women aren't property under law. True enough, but marriages can be dissolved, custody can be transferred. Your wife's father provided a dowry when you married, effectively a financial transaction. I'm simply proposing a different kind of exchange." "This is madness," Elijah said. Though his voice lacked the outrage the situation seemed to warrant. "No court would recognize such an arrangement. Judge Whitaker might see it differently," Crow named, the circuit judge who presided over Blackthorn County legal matters, "especially if both parties consent to the arrangement. Your wife's been essentially confined to your house for 3 years now. You've made no secret of your dissatisfaction with the marriage. I'm offering you an opportunity to resolve the situation with a valuable asset to show for it." Elijah stared at the horse trader, his mind visibly working through implications and possibilities. "Why would you want such an arrangement? This makes no sense." "My reasons are my own," Crow replied, "but I assure you they're entirely practical. I maintain a household that requires management. Your wife was educated by the Thibodeau family. She can read, write, keep accounts, manage servants. Those are useful skills. Her current physical condition doesn't concern me. I'm offering you freedom from a situation you've complained about publicly for 2 years, plus an asset worth $600. That's more generous than you deserve, considering the damage you did to my business." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Elijah raising objections that Crow systematically addressed. The legality could be managed through creative paperwork. Magnolia Belle's consent would be obtained. Crow seemed confident on this point, though he didn't explain why. The social scandal could be weathered, particularly if Elijah emerged from the situation with a valuable stallion that would enhance, rather than diminish, his status.
Throughout the discussion, Crow sat motionless on the Morgan, while Elijah paced the yard in front of his house. Finally, Elijah asked the question that revealed where his thinking had led. How would such an arrangement be documented? Crow produced a folded paper from his coat. "I've already drafted terms. Judge Whitaker has reviewed the language and confirmed it falls within his authority to notarize, provided both parties and your wife all sign freely. The transaction would be recorded at the courthouse as a mutual agreement dissolving your marriage and transferring custody, that's the legal term used, to me. In exchange for valuable consideration, the stallion's title transfers to you simultaneously." "And Magnolia Belle would agree to this?" Elijah asked, finally speaking his wife's name. "Why don't we ask her?" Crow said, dismounting for the first time. What happened inside the Hawthorne house over the next hour remained private, though the 2 house servants who were present would later provide fragmentary accounts that raised more questions than they answered. Crow spoke with Magnolia Belle alone in the parlor for nearly 40 minutes, while Elijah waited in his study. When Crow finally emerged, he reported that Mrs. Hawthorne had agreed to the arrangement and would sign the necessary documents. Elijah insisted on speaking with his wife himself, and their conversation lasted only 10 minutes. When he emerged, his face was pale, but set with determination. "We'll proceed," he said, "but I want this done properly, at the courthouse, with witnesses." "Agreed," Crow said. 4 days from now, September 14th, 10 in the morning. Bring your wife. I'll bring the horse and the documentation." The 4 days between that conversation and the courthouse meeting became a period of intense speculation throughout Sorrowfen. Rumors began circulating by that evening: fragmentary accounts from the Hawthorne house servants, observations from neighbors who had seen Crow's extended visit, whispered theories about what kind of business transaction would require such secrecy. By September 12th, enough people knew that something unusual was planned that a small crowd began to gather outside the Blackthorn County Courthouse that morning, drawn by gossip and morbid curiosity. September 14th, 1858 dawned clear and hot, with the kind of oppressive humidity that made clothing stick to skin and tempers turn short, the air thick with the scent of magnolia blooms rotting in the heat. Yes, even then, a harbinger of psychological horror.
By 9:30, more than 40 people had gathered in and around the courthouse, ostensibly conducting normal business, but actually waiting to see what would unfold. Judge Whitaker had cleared his morning docket, and the courthouse clerks prepared documents with unusual care, aware that whatever was recorded today would be scrutinized for years to come. Elijah Hawthorne arrived at 9:45 in his best carriage, driven by one of his enslaved workers. Magnolia Belle sat beside him, wearing a dark blue traveling dress that attempted to accommodate her size while maintaining some semblance of style. Her face showed no emotion that observers could read, neither distress nor satisfaction, just a kind of blank neutrality that made those watching uncertain about her state of mind. Reuben Silas Crow arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, leading the Morgan Stallion and carrying a leather document case. He wore a formal coat over his usual rough clothing, the contrast emphasizing his outsider status. Judge Whitaker met all three parties in his chambers, along with two courthouse clerks who would serve as witnesses. The documents that were signed that morning were later described by those who saw them as the most unusual legal instruments ever processed through Blackthorn County. The primary contract, written in Crow's clear hand on heavy paper, contained precise language. Elijah Hawthorne agreed to dissolve his marriage to Magnolia Belle Hawthorne and transfer full custody and responsibility for her welfare to Reuben Silas Crow. In exchange, Crow would transfer title to the Morgan Stallion to Elijah Hawthorne, along with breeding rights and full documentation of bloodlines. Both parties acknowledged receiving valuable consideration in the exchange. A separate document signed by Magnolia Belle alone stated her consent to the arrangement and her voluntary acceptance of Crow's custody and protection. The language carefully avoided specific terms that might make the arrangement legally challengeable while still creating a binding agreement that all parties understood. Judge Whitaker notarized both documents after questioning each signer individually about their free consent. His face, throughout the proceeding, remained professionally neutral, though several witnesses later reported that his hand hesitated before applying his seal to the papers. The entire proceeding lasted less than 30 minutes. When the parties emerged from the courthouse, Elijah Hawthorne held the Morgan's lead rope, while Reuben Silas Crow stood beside Magnolia Belle. The crowd that had gathered watched in shocked silence as the exchange was completed on the courthouse steps, in full daylight, as public and official as any property transaction in Blackthorn County history. Elijah mounted the Morgan and rode away without looking back at his former wife. Crow helped Magnolia Belle into a wagon he'd brought for the purpose, then drove west toward his property. The crowd dispersed slowly, people speaking in hushed voices about what they'd witnessed, uncertain whether they'd seen a scandal, a tragedy, or something so far outside normal social bounds that no familiar category could contain it. The Sorrowfin newspaper printed nothing about the transaction. The county's social elite closed ranks around the Hawthorne name, treating the matter as something too unseemly to acknowledge. But in kitchens and workshops, in the market square, and at the cotton gin, people talked about nothing else for weeks. Some called it the most shameful moment in Blackthorn County history. Others saw it as a kind of rough frontier justice, Crow taking satisfaction for the insult Elijah had delivered.
Almost no one in those first weeks considered what Magnolia Belle Hawthorne thought about the arrangement, and almost no one anticipated what was about to unfold on Reuben Silas Crow's property west of town. The 5 miles between the Sorrowfen courthouse and Reuben Silas Crow's property seemed to stretch far longer in Magnolia Belle's perception. She sat beside Crow in the wagon, her hands folded in her lap, watching the familiar landscape pass. Cotton fields she'd driven past countless times, the Hutchins farm where she'd once attended a quilting bee, the crossroads where the Sorrowfen Road intersected with the old Indian trace. Everything looked exactly as it always had, yet she was traveling through it as an entirely different person than she'd been that morning. Crow said nothing during the ride, his attention on the horses and the road. Magnolia Belle appreciated the silence. The events of the past 4 days had left her drained of words, though not of thought. Her mind continued working through what had happened and what was about to unfold, testing the boundaries of her new situation, like someone learning to walk after a long illness.
When Crow had first approached her in the Hawthorne parlor 4 days earlier, Magnolia Belle had been sitting by the window with needlework in her lap, the same position she occupied most afternoons. She'd heard his voice downstairs, speaking with Elijah. Then the house servant had summoned her to receive a visitor. Her immediate assumption had been that some crisis required her attention, possibly related to Elijah's business affairs. Instead, Crow had presented his proposal with the same straightforward manner he might use to discuss horse breeding. He wanted to trade a stallion for her. Elijah had challenged him to name terms for satisfaction, and these were his terms. The arrangement would be entirely legal and properly documented. Most importantly, and this was the point where Crow's voice had taken on an intensity that made Magnolia Belle focus completely on his words. The arrangement offered her something she'd lost 3 years ago: agency over her own life. "Your husband confines you to this house," Crow had said, "treats you like an embarrassment he can't solve. You have education, intelligence, capabilities he doesn't value because he can only see your size. I'm offering you the opportunity to use those capabilities in managing my household and business affairs. You'll work, Mrs. Hawthorne. You'll be useful. That's more than your current situation provides." The conversation lasted 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Magnolia Belle had asked only one substantive question: "What do you gain from this arrangement?" Crow's answer had been simple, and she sensed truthful satisfaction. "Your husband insulted me publicly and damaged my business, taking away what he considers a burden while making him acknowledge the transaction publicly. That's worth more to me than money." Now, as they approached Crow's property, Magnolia Belle saw it with fresh eyes. The house was smaller than she'd expected, a story and a half, built from local timber with a covered porch and stone chimney. The barn, by contrast, was substantial and well-maintained, with fresh paint and sturdy fencing. Several horses grazed in paddocks beyond the barn, and 3 men working near the corral stopped to watch the wagon approach. Josiah, the older black man Crow employed, came out onto the porch as they arrived. He was perhaps 60, with gray hair and the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to navigate complex social situations. His eyes took in Magnolia Belle's arrival with no visible surprise, though he must have heard rumors about what had transpired at the courthouse. "Josiah, this is Mrs. Hawthorne," Crow said, helping Magnolia Belle down from the wagon. "She'll be managing the household from now on. Please show her through the house and help her get settled." "Yes, sir," Josiah replied, his tone neutral. To Magnolia Belle, he said, "This way, man." The house's interior surprised her with its orderliness. The main room combined kitchen and sitting area, with a simple table, several chairs, and a cast-iron stove that looked recently installed. 2 doors led to smaller rooms. One clearly Crow's bedroom, the other a storage area converted into a second sleeping space. Everything was clean but Spartan, the home of someone who spent minimal time indoors, the faint scent of pine resin lingering like a ghost in the air. "Mr. Crow's gone most weeks," Josiah explained, showing Magnolia Belle around. "He keeps the house simple because he's not here to use much of it. I've been doing the cooking and cleaning, but it's more than one person can manage properly, especially with the horsework as well." Over the next several hours, as Josiah answered her questions and showed her how the property functioned, Magnolia Belle began to understand Crow's household. He employed Josiah and the 2 handlers, but the operation was expanding beyond what 3 men could effectively manage. Correspondence piled up unanswered. Financial records existed in fragmentary form across multiple ledgers. The house needed deep cleaning and better organization. Food preparation was adequate but uninspired. In short, Crow had been truthful. He needed household management, and Magnolia Belle possessed exactly the skills required. When Crow returned that evening, after settling the horses and speaking with his handlers, he found Magnolia Belle at the kitchen table with his ledgers spread before her, making notes on a separate sheet of paper. "You work quickly," he observed, taking a seat across from her. "You have invoices dating back 14 months that haven't been reconciled, and your feed costs are substantially higher than they should be. Either your supplier is overcharging or someone's taking a percentage." Crow leaned back in his chair, a slight smile crossing his face. "I knew you'd be useful. We need to discuss the terms of this arrangement more specifically," Magnolia Belle said, finally meeting his eyes.
you did at the courthouse was legal, but we both know it exists in questionable territory. I need to understand exactly what you expect from me and what I can expect from you." They talked until well after midnight that first night, working out the practical details of their situation. Magnolia Belle would manage all household affairs, keep Crow's business records, handle correspondence, and oversee the domestic side of the property. In return, she would have autonomy over those domains, a guaranteed allowance for personal expenses, and the understanding that Crow's custody was administrative rather than proprietary.
The arrangement was employment, not ownership, regardless of what the courthouse documents technically stated. "And the social situation?" Magnolia Belle asked. "People will talk. They'll assume certain things." "Let 'em talk," Crow said. "I'll be gone most of the time anyway. What matters is that you'll be doing useful work instead of sitting in a parlor waiting for your husband to be embarrassed by your existence." The blunt acknowledgement of her situation with Elijah should have stung, but instead, Magnolia Belle felt something close to relief. Crow dealt in plain facts, not social pretense. There was freedom in that directness. Over the following weeks, Magnolia Belle transformed Crow's household. She implemented systems for record-keeping that made his business finances clear at a glance. She negotiated better prices with suppliers, catching the feed cost irregularity Crow had been too busy to notice. She reorganized the house, established proper meal schedules, and began teaching Josiah more sophisticated cooking techniques using recipes from her mother's collection. The physical labor involved in managing a working property, combined with regular meals rather than the afternoon binges that had characterized her life at the Hawthorne house, began affecting her health. She lost weight gradually but noticeably, and more importantly, she regained the energy and focus that had drained away during her years of confined inactivity. Josiah proved an excellent collaborator. He'd been born enslaved in Kentucky and purchased his freedom in 1845, then worked his way to Mississippi, doing various jobs before Crow hired him. His experience navigating social hierarchies made him adept at managing the subtle complexities of their unusual household. He answered curious questions from visitors with polite vagueness and helped Magnolia Belle understand the local networks of commerce and reputation that governed business in Blackthorn County. Crow's two handlers, brothers named Harlan and Gideon Voss, were initially uncertain about Magnolia Belle's presence, but quickly came to appreciate the improvements in daily operations. They'd been handling their own cooking and domestic needs alongside horsework, and having those responsibilities lifted made their jobs considerably easier. Harlan, the older brother, possessed a gift for training difficult horses. Gideon had an eye for bloodlines and confirmation that rivaled Crow's own expertise. The property began functioning like a proper business rather than a loosely organized operation run by a man who was rarely present. When Crow returned from his trading trips, he found detailed reports on expenses, correspondence answered, and decisions made in his absence that consistently proved sound. Sorrowfen society, meanwhile, struggled to categorize what had occurred. The Hawthorne family name retained enough standing to prevent open scandal, but people whispered. Elijah appeared at agricultural association meetings with the Morgan Stallion, which became a topic of admiring conversation. Everyone agreed the horse was magnificent. Fewer people inquired about Mrs. Hawthorne, and Elijah offered no information. The general understanding, never stated explicitly, was that the marriage had dissolved under circumstances best left unexamined. Magnolia Belle's family in Willow Bend received a letter from her, explaining that her circumstances had changed and that she was now managing a household and business affairs for Mr. Crow. The letter's tone suggested employment rather than scandal, and the Thibodeau family, already somewhat distant from their daughter since her marriage, accepted this explanation without pressing for details. By November 1858, the immediate shock of the courthouse transaction had faded into background gossip, displaced by other concerns. Political tensions about territorial expansion and slavery's future dominated conversation. Sorrowfen continued its cotton-driven prosperity. Life moved forward, absorbing the unusual event the way communities always absorb things that don't fit comfortable categories. But on Crow's property, something more significant than a business arrangement was developing. I tell you true, the Southern Gothic veil thinned there. Magnolia Belle discovered that she possessed capabilities beyond household management. She understood horses, not with Crow's instinctive sense for breeding and training, but with an analytical mind that could track bloodlines, identify market opportunities, and manage the business side of horse trading with precision Crow had never achieved alone. When Crow returned from a buying trip to Louisiana in mid-December 1858, Magnolia Belle presented him with a proposal. She'd been corresponding with breeders in Kentucky and Tennessee, researching bloodlines and market prices. She'd identified an opportunity to acquire 3 mares with excellent Morgan heritage at prices below market value due to an estate sale in Lexington. The investment would be substantial, but the potential return through breeding and sales could transform Crow's operation from skilled one-man trading to legitimate breeding business. Crow studied her research, asked pointed questions about her analysis, then approved the purchase. "You're thinking bigger than I've been thinking," he said. "That's useful. I've spent 7 years watching my husband fail to think strategically about his plantation," Magnolia Belle replied. "I learned what not to do." The transaction that had begun as Crow's revenge on Elijah Hawthorne was evolving into an actual partnership, one based on mutual benefit and complementary skills, rather than the social and romantic foundations that were supposed to govern relationships between men and women in Blackthorn County society. It was this unexpected development that would make what came next so devastating. The Kentucky mares arrived in late January 1859, transported by rail to Jackson and then overland to Sorrowfen. They were everything Magnolia Belle's research had promised. 3 females from established Morgan lines, aged 4 to 6, with confirmed breeding history and temperament suited to both riding and harness work. The investment had required most of Crow's available capital, plus a loan from a Jackson bank arranged using the property as collateral. Harlan and Gideon Voss examined the mares with approval, and Crow himself spent 2 days assessing confirmation behavior before declaring the purchase sound.
The first breeding would occur in spring, and if the bloodlines proved as strong as expected, the resulting foals could command premium prices throughout Mississippi and beyond. Sorrowfen's horse trading community took notice. Crow's operation had been respected but modest. A skilled trader who could find quality animals and train them effectively. The mare purchase signaled something different, ambition toward breeding stock and long-term business rather than opportunistic trading. Several established breeders viewed this development with interest and some concern about competition. Elijah Hawthorne heard about the mares through agricultural association conversations and understood immediately where the capital for such a purchase had likely come from. The business acumen he dismissed in his former wife was now benefiting the man he'd grown to hate. The Morgan stallion he'd received in the trade grazed in his paddock. Impressive to look at, but also a daily reminder of the transaction that had obtained it. In February, Elijah appeared at Crow's property unannounced, riding the Morgan stallion. Magnolia Belle was working at the kitchen table with account books when she heard hooves approaching and looked out to see her former husband dismounting in the yard. She met him at the door before he could knock. "What do you want, Elijah?" His eyes took in the changes visible even from the porch. Her reduced size, her direct gaze, the confidence in her posture that had been absent during their marriage. "I want to discuss the terms of our agreement," he said. "There's nothing to discuss. The agreement was executed legally and is final." "I'm prepared to offer new terms," Elijah said. "I'll pay Crow double the stallion's value to reverse the arrangement." Magnolia Belle felt something cold settle in her chest. "I'm not a horse that can be traded back and forth at your convenience." "You signed documents giving Crow custody," Elijah replied. "That makes you subject to negotiation." "No," Magnolia Belle said simply. "The answer is no. Whatever arrangement you want to propose, discuss it with Mr. Crow. I'm telling you now that I won't agree to any reversal." Elijah's face hardened. "You've forgotten your place remarkably quickly." "I've found my place," Magnolia Belle corrected, "and it's not as your wife. Leave, Elijah." He stood there for another moment, clearly wanting to say more, then turned and remounted the Morgan. As he rode away, Magnolia Belle noticed Harlan Voss watching from the barn, having apparently observed the entire exchange. When Crow returned that evening from business in Jackson, Magnolia Belle told him about Elijah's visit. Crow listened without interrupting, then said, "He'll be back. Men like Hawthorne can't tolerate losing, especially when the loss becomes public knowledge. The mares made it public. Everyone in the county knows where the capital came from." "What will you do if he makes a formal offer?" Magnolia Belle asked. "I'll refuse,"
Crow said. "The arrangement we have works. I'm not interested in renegotiating." But Elijah Hawthorne's appearance had been a reconnaissance rather than a negotiation. What he'd seen at Crow's property, the improvements, the organization, the obvious success of the household and business, had confirmed his suspicions about where his former wife's capabilities were now directed. The knowledge festered. Throughout March and April 1859, Elijah began making inquiries around Sarafan about the legal status of the courthouse documents. He spoke with attorneys in Jackson and consulted with Judge Whitaker about the technical language used in the custody transfer. What he learned frustrated him. The documents were legally sound, if unconventional. Breaking the agreement would require proving either coercion or incompetence, and Elijah himself had publicly asserted Magnolia Belle's free consent at the courthouse. His focus shifted toward Crow's business operations. If he couldn't legally reclaim his former wife, he could potentially damage the enterprise she was helping to build. Elijah began spreading rumors about Crow's financial situation, suggesting the mare purchase had over-leveraged the property. He questioned the breeding quality of the new stock in conversations with other breeding previewers. He made it known that he considered Crow's operation unsound and advised against doing business with the horse trader. The campaign was subtle but effective. Several potential buyers who had been considering horses from Crow's property decided to look elsewhere. A breeding contract that Harlan Voss had been negotiating for the Morgan Stallion fell through after the other party expressed concerns about Crow's financial stability. Magnolia Belle recognized the pattern from her years observing plantation society. This was reputation warfare, the kind of social combat that could destroy businesses without any direct confrontation. She brought her concerns to Crow in early May. "Hawthorne's poisoning your business relationships," she said. "We need to counter it directly." "How?" Crow asked. "I can't defend against whispers and insinuations." "No," Magnolia Belle agreed, "but we can make the whispers irrelevant by demonstrating success. The mares will foal starting next month. If the bloodlines prove strong, we'll have evidence that overwhelms any rumor about financial stability." The first foal arrived on June 3, 1859, a filly with the distinctive Morgan build and a coat that matched her sire's deep coloring. Harlan Voss, who handled most of the actual breeding operations, pronounced the foal perfect. The second mare produced a colt 2 weeks later, equally impressive. The third foaling was expected in early July. Crow began receiving inquiries about the foals before they were even weaned. Word of quality bloodlines traveled quickly through horse breeding networks, and physical evidence of successful breeding carried more weight than any rumor about financial stability. Elijah Hawthorne's campaign of reputation damage appeared to be failing. Then on July 8, 1859, Magnolia Belle received a letter from her father in Willow Bend. The letter's tone was formal and cold, quite different from the occasional friendly correspondence they'd maintained since her move to Crow's property. Her father wrote that he'd learned details about the courthouse transaction from Elijah Hawthorne, who had apparently visited Willow Bend to provide his version of events. The Thibodeau family was, the letter stated, profoundly disturbed by the circumstances surrounding Magnolia Belle's current situation. Her father demanded that she return to the family home immediately to discuss the matter. Magnolia Belle read the letter twice, feeling the careful trap that had been constructed. Elijah had gone to Willow Bend not to inform her family out of concern, but to weaponize their reaction.
If she refused her father's summons, she would appear to be under Crow's improper control. If she complied, she would be subjected to family pressure to leave Crow's household and return to respectable society, which, given the circumstances, would likely mean returning to Elijah or accepting some other arrangement her family deemed appropriate. She showed the letter to Crow that evening. He read it silently, then handed it back. "Your decision," he said, "but understand that if you go to Willow Bend, your family will do everything possible to keep you there." "I know," Magnolia Belle said, "which is why I'm going to write my father and explain exactly what our arrangement entails. He deserves the truth, not Elijah's version." The letter Magnolia Belle composed took her 3 days to write properly. She detailed her situation during the final years of her marriage, the isolation, the humiliation, the complete absence of purpose or agency. She explained the courthouse transaction not as a scandal, but as an escape from circumstances her father had never witnessed. She described her current work, the household she managed, the business skills she developed. She made clear that Crow's custody was administrative partnership, not ownership or inappropriate relationship. Most importantly, she asserted her right to choose this situation over returning to either Elijah or to her father's house,
to be managed like an embarrassing problem requiring solution. Her father's response, arriving 2 weeks later, was brief. The family was disappointed in her choices and considered the matter closed. She would receive no further financial support or social acknowledgement from the Thibodeau family. Her brother would handle any inheritance matters when the time came, but she should not expect familial treatment. Magnolia Belle read this letter alone in the kitchen and allowed herself 15 minutes of grief before returning to the breeding record she'd been updating. She'd lost her family of origin, but she'd gained something they couldn't understand: work that mattered, skills that had value, partnership based on capability rather than social obligation. The third mare foaled in late July, producing twins, an extremely rare occurrence in horses, and one that carried significant risk. Harlan Voss worked through the night to save both foals and their mother. By morning, all three had survived, though the twins were small and required careful management. Despite the risk and extra work, the twins represented a marketing opportunity. Matched Morgan foals from quality bloodlines could command extraordinary prices from the right buyers. Magnolia Belle immediately began corresponding with breeders and wealthy horse enthusiasts throughout the South, promoting the unusual birth. By August, Crow's operation had shifted from merely profitable to genuinely successful. The original investment in the Kentucky mares had paid for itself through stud fees and advanced sales on the foals. The property's reputation within horse breeding circles had expanded beyond East Mississippi. Magnolia Belle's business management had transformed what had been scared individual trading into a legitimate commercial enterprise. Ah, brethren, the haunted rhythm of those hooves echoing still. Elijah Hawthorne watched this success with increasing fury. The courthouse transaction he'd agreed to, thinking he was ridding himself of a burden, had instead empowered the very person he dismissed as worthless, while simultaneously benefiting his enemy. Every conversation in Sorrowfen about Crow's breeding success was an implicit reminder of Elijah's miscalculation. In September 1859, Elijah made one final attempt at direct negotiation. He appeared at Crow's property with a formal written proposal. He would pay $3,000, several times the original Stallion's value, to reverse the custody arrangement. The document was properly drafted with spaces for Crow's and Magnolia Belle's signatures. Crow received him in the yard, not inviting him into the house. Magnolia Belle watched from the porch, while Josiah stood nearby, his presence a quiet statement of household solidarity. "I'm not interested in your offer," Crow said after reading the proposal. "That's an extraordinary sum," Elijah replied, "more than your entire property is worth." "Nevertheless," Crow said, handing back the document, "the arrangement we have suits me perfectly. Mrs. Hawthorne has proven invaluable to my operations. Why would I give that up?" "She's my wife," Elijah said, his voice rising. "The document said custody, not ownership, which means the arrangement can be modified." "She was your wife," Crow corrected, "and the custody arrangement stands as executed. The matter is closed." Elijah looked past Crow to where Magnolia Belle stood on the porch. "You actually prefer this? Working like a servant for a horse trader? You could return to proper society." "I prefer useful work to decorative confinement," Magnolia Belle replied. "The answer is no, Elijah. It will always be no." Elijah's face went through several emotions before settling on cold rage. "You'll both regret this," he said. "I promise you that." He rode away on the Morgan Stallion, his back rigid with fury. And this time, everyone present understood that something had shifted. The situation had moved beyond business dispute or social awkwardness into territory where Elijah Hawthorne's humiliation demanded satisfaction of a different kind. What none of them anticipated was how carefully Elijah had already been preparing that satisfaction, or how far his planning had already progressed. The first indication of real danger came not from Elijah Hawthorne directly, but from an unexpected quarter. In late September, Josiah mentioned to Magnolia Belle that he'd encountered one of Elijah's enslaved workers at the Sorrowfen market. The man named Ezekiel had approached Josiah privately and delivered a cryptic warning.
Tell Mrs. Hawthorne to be careful. Mr. Elijah is planning something bad. When pressed for details, Ezekiel had shaken his head. I don't know exactly what, but he's been meeting with men from Jackson. Rough men, not planters, and he's been asking questions about Mr. Crow's schedule. When he's home, when he's traveling. Magnolia Belle brought this information to Crow that evening.
His reaction was immediate and serious. Hawthorne's hiring violence, he said. That's what those meetings mean. For what purpose? Magnolia Belle asked, though she already suspected the answer. To destroy what he can't reclaim, Crow replied. If he can't reverse the arrangement legally, he'll eliminate it physically. Over the next 2 weeks, Crow made quiet preparations. He spoke with Harlan and Gideon Voss about maintaining vigilance around the property. He purchased 2 additional rifles and distributed them among his workers. He varied his travel schedule to make patterns less predictable. Most significantly, he began sleeping in the barn rather than the house, reasoning that any attack would likely target him directly. Nothing happened. The October weeks passed peacefully, with autumn work proceeding normally. The Morgan foals continued growing strong, several sales contracts were finalized, and Crow's breeding reputation continued expanding. The warning from Ezekiel began to seem excessive caution, or perhaps even Elijah's attempted intimidation, rather than precursor to actual violence. Then on the night of October 23, 1859, everything changed. Crow had left for Alabama 3 days earlier, planning to be gone for a week pursuing a buying opportunity. His absence was known throughout Sorrowfen. He'd mentioned the trip at several businesses in town while making preparations. The property's defense therefore fell to Harlan and Gideon Voss, Josiah, and Magnolia Belle herself. The attack came at 2 in the morning. Magnolia Belle woke to Josiah pounding on her bedroom door, shouting about fire. She emerged to see orange light flickering through the windows. The barn was burning. She ran outside in her nightdress to chaos. The barn's entire west side was engulfed in flames, and she could hear horses screaming inside, the acrid smoke coiling like serpents from the pit. Mercy upon those trapped souls. Harlan and Gideon were already working to open the barn doors and lead animals out, while Josiah had begun hauling water from the well, though everyone knew the fire was already too large to fight effectively. Through the smoke and confusion, Magnolia Belle caught glimpses of figures moving in the darkness beyond the fire's light. At least 3 men on horseback, watching from a safe distance, not helping, not fleeing, just watching. The next 30 minutes existed in fragments of memory that Magnolia Belle would never fully piece together coherently. Harlan managed to lead 6 horses to safety before the barn's roof began collapsing. 2 of the Kentucky mares and the Morgan Stallion's first filly were trapped inside when the structure fell, their screams cutting off suddenly as burning timber buried them. The other foals survived only because they'd been in a paddock rather than the barn, and Gideon managed to lead them away before the fire spread. By the time the barn's roof completely collapsed in a shower of sparks, Magnolia Belle stood in the yard with her face blackened by smoke, watching everything Crow had built burn. The 3 riders she'd glimpsed earlier had vanished. Sorrowfen's volunteer fire brigade arrived near dawn, too late to save the barn, but in time to prevent the fire from spreading to the house or other outbuildings. They worked until mid-morning containing the blaze, then stood among the smoking ruins, discussing the cause. The fire marshal, a Sorrowfen merchant named Hargrove, made his assessment quickly. "Arson," he said, pointing to scorch marks on the barn's west side. "Someone used accelerant here and here. This wasn't an accident." "Who would do such a thing?" Harlan Voss asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "That's for the sheriff to determine," Hargrove replied. "But whoever did this knew their business. Professional work." The sheriff arrived later that day, interviewed everyone present, examined the remains, and took notes. He asked if anyone had enemies or knew of threats against the property. Magnolia Belle mentioned Elijah Hawthorne's previous visits and barely veiled threats, but carefully avoided giving the sheriff enough information to understand the full context of their dispute. "I'll look into it," the sheriff said, in the tone of someone who'd already decided the investigation would lead nowhere. Arson was notoriously difficult to prove without witnesses, and the men Magnolia Belle had glimpsed in the darkness were long gone. Crow returned
from Alabama 2 days later to find his barn destroyed, 3 valuable horses dead, and his operation's physical infrastructure severely damaged. He stood in the ruins for a long time without speaking, his face showing no emotion, while Harlan Voss detailed what had happened. When Harlan finished, Crow turned to Magnolia Belle. "You saw riders, 3 men on horseback, watching from beyond the fire's light," she confirmed. "They left before the fire brigade arrived. And the sheriff? He took statements and left. I don't think he'll pursue it seriously." Crow nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. Hawthorne didn't do this personally. He hired it done, which means there's no proof connecting him to it. He's probably in Jackson or somewhere else with witnesses to establish he wasn't here. "What do we do?" Magnolia Belle asked. "We rebuild, and we prepare for the next attempt, because everyone understood, though no one said it explicitly, that this wouldn't be Elijah Hawthorne's final move. The barn burning had been revenge, but it had also been a demonstration, proof that Elijah could strike at Crow's operation whenever he chose and that the law wouldn't protect them. The financial damage from the fire was substantial. The barn itself represented significant capital, but the lost horses were even more costly. 2 of the Kentucky mares had died, irreplaceable breeding stock. One of the Morgan foals was gone, along with months of investment in care and training. Insurance, to the extent it existed for such properties in 1859 Mississippi, didn't cover arson when the perpetrators remained unidentified.
Word of the fire spread quickly through horse breeding circles, and potential buyers began expressing concerns about the stability of Crow's operation. Elijah Hawthorne, meanwhile, made a point of appearing at the Agricultural Association's November meeting with expressions of sympathy for Crow's misfortune. He offered condolences on the lost horses, and even suggested that if Crow needed to sell any remaining stock to cover rebuilding costs, he would consider purchasing at fair prices. The performance was masterful. Elijah positioned himself as magnanimous neighbor rather than vengeful enemy, and several men present commented on his generous spirit. Only those who understood the full context of the situation recognized the display for what it was, a public assertion of victory. Magnolia Belle watched all this from a distance, through reports from Josiah and the Voss brothers, who heard the gossip in Sorrowfen. She spent her days working through Crow's finances, trying to find paths toward recovery that didn't require selling their remaining breeding stock at depressed prices. It was during this period of financial crisis that Magnolia Belle discovered something that changed her understanding of their entire situation. She'd been reviewing Crow's correspondence files, looking for potential buyers or business contacts who might provide favorable terms for rebuilding loans. Deep in a stack of letters from 1858, before the courthouse transaction, she found an exchange between Crow and a horse breeder in Kentucky that referenced Elijah Hawthorne specifically. The Kentucky breeder had written asking about potential customers in East Mississippi for Morgan bloodstock. Crow's response, dated July 1858, included this paragraph: "Elijah Hawthorne of Sorrowfen has money but lacks judgment in horseflesh. He recently purchased a gelding from me and later complained about a minor defect, demanding refund. I suspect he seeks to establish reputation as difficult customer to negotiate future discounts. I don't recommend him as a buyer unless you want trouble." The letter was dated weeks before the famous dispute at the Agricultural Association meeting, which meant the split hoof incident that had supposedly triggered Crow's desire for revenge had been known to Crow well in advance of their public confrontation. Magnolia Belle sat with the letter for a long time, understanding crystallizing slowly. The horse sale hadn't caused the dispute. Crow had known the gelding had a defect and sold it anyway, anticipating Elijah's complaint. The Agricultural Association confrontation hadn't been unexpected insult. It had been a deliberately engineered situation where Elijah would publicly challenge Crow to name terms for satisfaction. Everything that followed, the courthouse transaction, the custody arrangement, the building partnership between Crow and Magnolia Belle, had been Crow's planned response to a situation he'd created intentionally. She'd known their arrangement was partly revenge, but she hadn't realized how carefully Crow had orchestrated every step, including the original provocation. When Crow returned to the house that evening, Magnolia Belle was waiting with the Kentucky letter on the table between them. "You engineered the entire dispute with Elijah," she said, without preamble. "The defective horse, the public confrontation, all of it." Crow looked at the letter, then at Magnolia Belle. "Yes?" Why? Because I needed household management and business partnership, Crow replied, and you needed escape from a situation that was destroying you. The courthouse transaction accomplished both. You manipulated both of us, Magnolia Belle said. You created a situation where Elijah would feel compelled to challenge you. Knowing you could propose an arrangement he'd be desperate enough to accept. I created an opportunity, Crow corrected. You chose to take it. So did Hawthorne. I didn't force either of you to sign those documents. Magnolia Belle felt anger and something else, grudging respect for the calculation involved, mixed with recognition that Crow's manipulation had indeed given her capabilities and purpose she'd lost during her marriage. What happens now? Elijah burns down your barn, maybe kills us next. Was that part of your planning? No, Crow admitted. I underestimated how far Hawthorne's pride would drive him. That's my miscalculation. They sat in silence for several minutes, the candles burning down between them, both understanding that they'd reached a critical juncture. The partnership they'd built, regardless of how it had been initiated, was now threatened by escalating violence neither of them had anticipated. We need to end this, Magnolia Belle said finally, before someone dies. Agreed, Crow replied. The question is how. What neither of them yet realized was that Elijah Hawthorne had already decided how their situation would end, and his plan was far more comprehensive than a burned barn. The answer to Crow's question arrived 2 weeks later, though not in any form either he or Magnolia Belle anticipated. On November 18, 1859, the Blackthorn County Sheriff appeared at Crow's property with a deputy and a formal warrant. The charge was fraud, specifically misrepresentation in the courthouse transaction of September 1858. Elijah Hawthorne had filed a complaint alleging that Crow had coerced Magnolia Belle to sign the custody documents, that the transaction had been fundamentally fraudulent, and that Crow had profited from illegal manipulation of his former wife. The warrant demanded that Crow appear at the courthouse for examination by Judge Whitaker, with possible criminal charges to follow, depending on the hearing's outcome. The timing was deliberately chosen. Crow was scheduled to leave for Louisiana in 2 days for a crucial breeding negotiation, and the hearing would force him to remain in Sorrowfen. This is absurd, Crow said, reading the warrant. Mrs. Hawthorne signed those documents freely, with the judge present. That's for the court to determine, the sheriff replied. The hearing is set for day after tomorrow, 10 o'clock in the morning. Don't consider leaving town. That would make things considerably worse. After the sheriff left, Magnolia Belle and Crow sat at the kitchen table with the warrant between them, understanding the sophistication of Elijah's strategy. He couldn't prove Crow had burned the barn, but he could weaponize the very documents that had made their arrangement legal.
By alleging fraud and coercion, Elijah transformed himself from a grieved party into protector of his former wife's interests. He'll testify that you manipulated, Magnolia Belle said, that I couldn't have freely consented because of my circumstances during our marriage, my isolation, my size, my dependence on him. He'll paint me as victim rather than participant, which undermines everything you've accomplished here, Crow observed. If the court accepts that argument, it declares you incompetent to make decisions about your own life. Exactly, Magnolia Belle said. Either I was coerced, which makes you a criminal, or I was competent, which makes Elijah look foolish for the original transaction. He's betting the court will find coercion more acceptable than admitting I chose this situation. The hearing, 2 days later, filled the courthouse with spectators drawn by gossip about the unusual case. Elijah appeared with an attorney from Jackson, a persuasive speaker named Fulton, who specialized in property disputes. Crow and Magnolia Belle arrived together without legal representation. Crow couldn't afford an attorney after the barn fire, and the speed of the hearing had left no time to arrange proper defense. Judge Whitaker presided with visible discomfort, clearly wishing this matter had never entered his courtroom. He'd notarized the original documents, which made him partly complicit in whatever had occurred. Fulton opened by painting a picture of Magnolia Belle's situation during her marriage, isolated, humiliated, dependent entirely on her husband's provision. He called Elijah to testify about his former wife's increasing size and withdrawal from society, emphasizing how these factors had made her vulnerable to exploitation. Mr. Crow, Fulton said during his presentation, identified Mrs. Hawthorne's weakness and exploited it for his own benefit. He manipulated a vulnerable woman into signing documents that effectively made her his property, all under guise of legal transaction. This is fraud of the worst kind, taking advantage of someone's desperate circumstances for personal gain. When Crow's turn came to respond, he had no attorney to filter his words. He stood before Judge Whitaker and spoke directly. Mrs. Hawthorne signed those documents of her own free will in this courthouse with you as witness. She's since demonstrated through her work managing my household and business that she's perfectly capable of making sound decisions. The fraud here isn't mine. It's Mr. Hawthorne's attempt to undo a legal transaction because he's realized it benefited everyone except him. And what of the custody language? Judge Whitaker asked. That was unusual phrasing. It was honest phrasing, Crow replied. I took responsibility for Mrs. Hawthorne's welfare in exchange for valuable consideration. That's exactly what happened. Whether that makes people uncomfortable is separate from whether it was legal. The hearing continued through the afternoon, with testimony from several witnesses about Magnolia Belle's current situation. Josiah described the household's normal functioning. Harlan Voss discussed her business management. Even Gideon, usually quiet, testified that Mrs. Hawthorne made decisions about the property's operations that were consistently sound. Finally, Judge Whitaker called Magnolia Belle herself to testify. She took the stand, aware that everything she said would be scrutinized for signs of either coercion or incompetence. Mrs. Hawthorne, Judge Whitaker said, did Mr. Crow coerce you into signing the September documents? No, Magnolia Belle replied clearly. He presented an option, and I chose to accept it. Were you aware of the implications of those documents? Completely. I understood that I was dissolving my marriage and accepting Mr. Crow's custody, which meant, in practical terms, working for him in exchange for household management authority and personal autonomy. And you considered this preferable to remaining married to Mr. Hawthorne? Magnolia Belle looked directly at Elijah before answering. I spent 3 years confined to a house, treated as an embarrassment my husband couldn't solve. Mr. Crow offered me useful work and respect for my capabilities. Yes, I considered and still consider that preferable. Fulton attempted to undermine her testimony with questions about her emotional state during the marriage, her isolation, her dependence. But Magnolia Belle answered each question with calm precision, making clear that she'd chosen her current situation not from desperation, but from recognition that it offered better opportunities than her marriage had provided. When the testimony concluded, Judge Whitaker adjourned the hearing to consider his decision. The courthouse emptied slowly, with spectators discussing what they'd heard in hushed groups. Crow and Magnolia Belle returned to the property to wait. 2 days passed, with no word from the court. Then 3 days. The uncertainty stretched into a full week, while life on the property continued with the artificial normality of people waiting for judgment. On the 8th day, a courier arrived with Judge Whitaker's written decision. Crow read it first, his expression unreadable, then handed it to Magnolia Belle. The ruling was careful and technical. Judge Whitaker found no evidence of coercion in the September 1858 transaction. The documents had been signed freely by competent parties with full understanding of their implications. However, and this was the critical point, the judge declared the custody language inappropriate and potentially invalid under Mississippi marriage law. His solution was to effectively dissolve the custody arrangement while leaving the marriage dissolution intact. Magnolia Belle was declared a free woman, neither married to Elijah Hawthorne nor under Crow's custody. Any continued relationship between Crow and Magnolia Belle would need to be structured as standard employment rather than the unusual custody framework. The ruling satisfied no one. Elijah had failed to prove fraud, but he'd succeeded in undermining the legal framework of Crow's arrangement. Crow retained Magnolia Belle's work, but lost the formal custody that had protected the situation from certain kinds of social criticism. Magnolia Belle gained explicit legal independence, but lost the documentary protection the custody arrangement had provided. Most significantly, the ruling left open questions about what would happen next. The barn was still burned.
The breeding operation remained financially stressed, and Elijah Hawthorne, having failed to achieve complete victory through legal means, now faced a choice about whether to escalate further. The answer came on November 30th, when Harlan Voss discovered 3 of their remaining mares dead in their paddock, poisoned with something that had been mixed into their feed. The poisoning was precise. Only the breeding mares were affected, not the ordinary stock or the foals. This time, there was no ambiguity about the target. Someone was systematically destroying Crow's breeding operation, horse by horse, attack by attack, and everyone involved knew who was responsible, even if proof remained elusive. Crow stood in the paddock among the dead mares, his face finally showing the anger he'd suppressed through months of escalating conflict. "He won't stop," he said to Magnolia Belle. "Not until he's destroyed everything or we're dead." "Then we need to finish this ourselves," Magnolia Belle replied, "because the law won't do it for us." What she proposed over the next several hours would have shocked anyone who'd known her as Elijah Hawthorne's isolated, humiliated wife. But the woman who'd emerged from that isolation had learned something crucial from her months managing Crow's business. Power came from understanding what people valued and being willing to threaten it. Elijah Hawthorne valued his reputation above everything else, his standing in Blackthorn County society, his position in the Agricultural Association, his membership in the Masonic Lodge. These defined his identity more than his actual wealth or property. The courthouse transaction had damaged that reputation, and his subsequent legal efforts had failed to restore it. Magnolia Belle knew things about Elijah that no one else did. 7 years of marriage had given her intimate knowledge of his business practices, his financial arrangements, and most importantly, his secrets. She'd kept silent about these matters, partly for lingering loyalty, partly for understanding that exposing them would reflect badly on her as well. But now, facing systematic destruction of everything she'd built, she reconsidered that silence. "I can destroy him," she told Crow. "Not his property, his reputation, everything he values." "How?" Crow asked. What Magnolia Belle had discovered during her marriage, through overheard conversations and documents Elijah had carelessly left accessible, was that Elijah Hawthorne's plantation operated through illegal labor practices that even by 1859 standards were shocking. He'd been purchasing enslaved workers from the banned African trade through intermediaries in Louisiana, something explicitly forbidden by both federal and Mississippi law since 1808. The documentation existed, bills of sale with dates that prove the origin of several workers who'd appeared on the Hawthorne property during Magnolia Belle's marriage. Exposing this would destroy Elijah socially and legally. He'd face criminal charges, lose his position in every organization that mattered, and quite possibly lose his property through legal forfeiture. The scandal would make the courthouse transaction look trivial by comparison. "That's dangerous information to release," Crow said after Magnolia Belle explained. "It could implicate you as well. You were married to him when some of those transactions occurred." "I have documentation proving I knew nothing about it until after the fact," Magnolia Belle replied. "Elijah was careful to keep those particular business matters hidden from me, but I found his records and I kept my own copies." She'd done so originally as insurance, a way to protect herself if Elijah ever decided to discard her completely. Now, that insurance became a weapon. The question was whether to actually use it. Exposing Elijah would end his attacks, but it would also create a scandal that would touch everyone involved. Crow's reputation would survive. He was already outside respectable society, but Magnolia Belle would forever be known as the woman who destroyed her former husband, and that reputation would follow her, regardless of how justified the revelation might be. They debated through the night, weighing options and consequences. By morning, they'd reached a decision not to expose Elijah publicly, but to threaten exposure privately and see if that threat would be sufficient to end his campaign. Crow drafted a letter that laid out exactly what Magnolia Belle knew about Elijah's illegal labor purchases, including specific dates, amounts, and the Louisiana intermediaries involved.
The letter concluded with a straightforward proposition. Elijah would cease all attacks on Crow's property and leave them both alone, or the information would be delivered to the federal marshal in Jackson and to every newspaper in East Mississippi. Harlan Voss delivered the letter to the Hawthorne plantation personally, handing it to Elijah in front of his house with explicit instructions to read it immediately. Elijah read the letter, his face going through visible transformations as he understood what Magnolia Belle was threatening. When he finished, he looked up at Harlan and said simply, "Tell Crow I understand." For 3 weeks, nothing happened. No more attacks, no legal maneuvering, no contact at all. Life on Crow's property slowly returned to normal operations. The dead mares were replaced through purchases that depleted their remaining reserves. Rebuilding the barn began with lumber purchased on credit. The Morgan foals continued their development and breeding contracts were cautiously negotiated. Elijah Hawthorne appeared at agricultural association meetings but avoided any mention of Crow or the courthouse transaction. He interacted with other planters on normal business matters, his behavior giving no indication of the threat hanging over him. To those watching from outside, it seemed the conflict had simply exhausted itself, but those directly involved understood the precarious balance that had been achieved. Elijah held back by threat of exposure. Crow and Magnolia Belle protected by knowledge they possessed, but couldn't safely reveal without destroying themselves as well. And this stalemate, fragile and unsatisfying to everyone, is how the situation stood when winter arrived in Blackthorn County, bringing cold rain and the kind of gray skies that matched everyone's mood about how things had been resolved. Mercy, the rain falling like tears on forgotten graves.
The final chapter of the story unfolded not through dramatic confrontation, but through gradual transformation of all parties involved. Crow's breeding operation rebuilt slowly through 1860 and 1861. The barn was reconstructed by early spring, larger and better ventilated than before. The replacement mares proved productive, and the Morgan foals developed into impressive young horses that commanded good prices despite the increasing political tensions consuming the nation's attention. By late 1861, the property had recovered most of what the barn fire and poisoning had destroyed. Magnolia Belle's role in this recovery was substantial and increasingly public. She no longer operated from behind household management, but began attending horse sales and breeding exhibitions personally, representing Crow's business interests when he traveled. The unusual nature of their arrangement, a woman managing a horse trader's commercial operations, attracted curiosity, but her demonstrable competence gradually overcame social skepticism. The judge's ruling that dissolved the custody framework had actually freed Magnolia Belle to operate more independently. Without the legal ambiguity of custody, she could present herself as Crow's business partner and household manager, roles that, while unusual, were at least comprehensible within existing social categories. Several other women in Blackthorn County who managed family businesses began seeking her advice on financial matters, creating connections Magnolia Belle had never possessed during her marriage. Elijah Hawthorne, meanwhile, retreated into increasingly rigid conventionality. He married again in summer 1860, a young woman from Jackson whose family connections enhanced his social standing. He continued serving in the Agricultural Association and maintained his plantation operations with meticulous attention to propriety. To external observers, he appeared to have successfully moved past the scandal of the courthouse transaction, but those who knew him better recognized changes. His judgments became more cautious, his business dealings more conservative. He avoided any situation that might attract scrutiny or controversy. The threat of exposure Magnolia Belle held over him transformed him from aggressive social climber into someone constantly managing potential risk. The Morgan Stallion he'd received in the original transaction remained in his paddock, a daily reminder of the exchange that had defined all their fates. Elijah never bred the horse or sold it, keeping it instead like a trophy whose meaning had become increasingly ambiguous over time. When Mississippi seceded in January 1861, 1861, and war became inevitable. All three principals in the courthouse transaction faced its consequences. Crow continued horse trading, but now dealt primarily with Confederate military buyers who needed quality stock for cavalry and artillery. The work was profitable, but carried risks. Travel became more dangerous, and military authorities sometimes requisitioned horses at prices below market value. Elijah joined the Confederate militia as an officer, leveraging his social position into a captain's commission. He served primarily in administrative roles, managing supply logistics rather than seeing combat. His new wife ran the plantation during his absences, relying on overseer management that proved less effective than Elijah's direct supervision. Magnolia Belle kept Crow's business functioning throughout the war years, managing increasingly complex arrangements as Union blockades and Confederate currency problems disrupted normal commerce. She developed barter networks that allowed them to acquire necessary supplies, and she negotiated with military authorities on horse requisitions with skill that often secured better terms than forced seizure would have provided. The war years created opportunities for women to assume business roles that peacetime society would have denied them, and Magnolia Belle used those opportunities to fully establish herself as a legitimate commercial figure in Blackthorn County. By 1863, people referred to Crow's operation with the understanding that Magnolia Belle managed much of its daily functioning. The threatened exposure of Elijah's illegal labor practices never occurred. Magnolia Belle kept the documentation carefully preserved, but the chaos of war made such revelations seem less significant than simple survival. Moreover, as her own position stabilized, the weapon lost some of its appeal. Using it would create scandal that might touch her as well, and she no longer needed that level of destruction to protect herself. Elijah appeared to understand this calculation, and the fragile truce between them solidified into something more permanent. They avoided each other when possible, and maintained cold courtesy when circumstances required interaction. The courthouse transaction became an acknowledged but unmentioned piece of Blackthorn County history, the kind of scandal people knew about but didn't discuss in polite company. Crow himself changed least among the principals. He continued traveling for horse trading, returning to Sorrowfen with quality stock, and trusting Magnolia Belle with management during his absences. His business flourished despite war disruptions, partly because military demand for horses remained constant, and partly because Magnolia Belle's management proved more effective than his solo operations had ever been. The partnership they'd begun through manipulation and revenge had evolved into something genuine, mutual respect based on complementary skills and shared interest in the business's success. Whether it would be characterized as friendship, business association, or something more complex was unclear and perhaps irrelevant. It worked, which was what mattered to both of them. When the war ended in spring 1865, Blackthorn County faced its own reconstruction. Confederate currency became worthless, requiring all business arrangements to be renegotiated. Federal occupation brought new authorities and regulations. The plantation economy that had structured society began its slow collapse as slavery ended, and labor relations had to be completely reimagined. Elijah Hawthorne's plantation struggled through this transition. His Confederate officer service made him subject to initial federal scrutiny, though he faced no serious charges.
The labor force he'd built through questionable means dispersed as freedom came, and rebuilding with paid workers proved more expensive and less efficient than his previous operations. His social position, so carefully cultivated before the war, meant less in the changed circumstances of Reconstruction Mississippi. Crow's operation, by contrast, adapted relatively smoothly. Horse breeding and trading continued under similar economic principles, regardless of political changes. The business Magnolia Belle had helped build functioned on commercial relationships rather than enslaved labor, making transition easier. They sold horses to federal cavalry units at the same prices they charged Confederates, indifferent to political loyalties, in favor of reliable customers. By 1867, nearly a decade after the courthouse transaction, the situation had reached a kind of final resolution. Elijah Hawthorne remained a diminished but respectable planter, his reputation intact enough to
function in county society, but lacking the prominence he'd once possessed. His second marriage produced 3 children, giving him the family he'd wanted. He never again attempted to reverse or challenge the September 1858 documents. Magnolia Belle emerged as a recognized business figure in Blackthorn County, unusual but no longer scandalous. She continued managing Crow's operations with increasing authority, eventually negotiating major breeding contracts with buyers throughout the South and beyond. Her weight stabilized at a healthy level, and she regained the energy and confidence she'd lost during her marriage. She never remarried, finding the independence of her current situation preferable to conventional domestic arrangements. Crow built his breeding operation into one of the most successful in East Mississippi, with reputation extending well beyond Blackthorn County. He continued his itinerant lifestyle, traveling for business and leaving daily management to Magnolia Belle and their expanded staff. The partnership that had begun as revenge scheme became a model for effective business collaboration, though its unusual origins ensured it would never be replicated by others. The barn fire and mare poisoning were never officially solved. The perpetrators, whoever they might have been, disappeared into the general chaos of war years, and by the time relative peace returned, pursuing justice for events from 1859 seemed less important than managing present challenges. Josiah remained with the household through all these changes, transitioning from enslaved worker to paid employee after emancipation and continuing in his role as household manager and informal advisor to both Crow and Magnolia Belle. His presence provided continuity through all the transformations the property underwent. The courthouse documents that had created so much controversy were eventually filed deep in Blackthorn County archives, where they remained as curious historical artifacts. Occasionally, researchers examining county records from the antebellum period would discover them and puzzle over the unusual custody language and the circumstances that had produced such an arrangement. By 1870, when the federal census recorded Blackthorn County's population and property, all 3 principals in the courthouse transaction appeared in their separate listings: Elijah Hawthorne as planter and farmer, Reuben Silas Crow as horse breeder, and Magnolia Belle Hawthorne, still using her married name despite the dissolved marriage, as business manager. The census taker noted no special circumstances about any of them. The story might have ended there, relegated to minor county gossip and eventually forgotten as participants died and memory faded. But Magnolia Belle, with her habit of documenting important events, had kept detailed records of everything that had occurred from September 1858 forward. She compiled these records into a leather-bound journal, not for publication, but for her own understanding of how her life had been transformed. The journal remained in her possession until her death in 1891, when it passed to one of Elijah Hawthorne's daughters by his second marriage. Magnolia Belle had maintained cordial, if distant, relationships with Elijah's children, particularly the girls. The journal eventually found its way to the Blackthorn County Historical Society, where it was preserved among other documents from Sorrow Fen's 19th century history. Modern readers encountering the courthouse transaction through Magnolia Belle's journal and the archived legal documents struggle to categorize what occurred. Was it human trafficking? Probably not by the legal definitions of the time, though it certainly involved treating a woman as property in ways modern sensibilities find disturbing. Was it fraud? Judge Whitaker ruled it wasn't, though Crow's deliberate manipulation of circumstances troubles contemporary understanding of consent. What emerges most clearly from the historical record is that all 3 principals, Elijah, Magnolia Belle, and Crow, made choices within the constraints and opportunities available to them in Blackthorn County, Mississippi in the late 1850s. Some of those choices were admirable, others deeply questionable. The consequences rippled through their lives and community in ways none of them fully anticipated. The Morgan Stallion Elijah received in the exchange lived until 1872, producing numerous foals that carried his bloodline throughout Mississippi horse breeding circles. Descendants of those horses can still be found in modern Morgan registries, their pedigrees traceable back to the animal that was traded for a woman's custody on a September morning in Sorrow Fen. Whether the story represents justice,
Exploitation, liberation, revenge, or some combination of all these things remains subject to interpretation. What is certain is that it happened exactly as the courthouse documents and Magnolia Belle's journal record it, a transaction that challenged every assumption about how Southern society functioned and how people within that society negotiated power, dignity, and survival. The leather-bound deed that started everything remains in the Blackthorn County Historical Society's restricted archives, requiring special permission to examine. The handwriting is still clear, the signatures distinct, the terms unambiguous. 4 witnessed signatures on a legal document, 1 purebred Morgan Stallion, and a woman who became property in the eyes of the law, then used that impossible situation to build something better than what she'd lost. And so, the flame gutters low, fading into silence like a hymn whispered to the night. Amen. If these shadowed confessions stir your soul, brethren, subscribe to Forgotten Liturgy for more revelations from history's haunted crypts.